The sandstorm descended without warning, a wall of choking amber that devoured the horizon in seconds. Alone on her dying farm, Marion Thorne stood transfixed as the approaching tempest swallowed everything in its path. Though she had barely enough stores to sustain herself through the coming days, fate would soon test her compassion in ways that would forever alter the course of her solitary existence. The wind had a voice that afternoon, a low, hungry growl that scraped across the barren fields like metal against stone. Marion pulled her threadbare cloak tighter around her shoulders, her knuckles white against the worn wool. The weathered farmhouse, once her pride when Lord Thorne still drew breath, now stood defiant yet diminished against the approach of nature's fury. She hurried to secure what little remained. The single goat, thin-flanked but stubborn as its mistress, bleated in protest as she dragged it toward the small stone outbuilding. The meager harvest, already gathered and stored, would have to suffice. 3 sacks of grain, half a wheel of hard cheese, dried herbs hanging from the rafters. A nobleman would call it nothing, but it was everything to a widow, cast aside by those who once called themselves neighbors. "Hold fast," she whispered, more to herself than the trembling walls. Around her, the first gust slammed against the shutters, sending dust spiraling through every crack and seam. Marion moved with practiced efficiency, stuffing rags beneath the door, covering the precious stores with oiled cloth, filling 2 buckets with water from the barrel she'd dragged inside yesterday. Her hands bore the calluses of a woman who had learned to survive without mercy or charity. 5 seasons had passed since fever took Lord Thorne, leaving behind debts that stripped away their standing, their servants, and finally, the respect of the village. The storm's roar intensified, drowning out her thoughts as she secured the last shutter. Through the narrow gap, the world outside had vanished, replaced by a writhing wall of amber and grey. The air inside already tasted of dust and desperation. She allowed herself one moment of weakness, pressing her forehead against the rough-hewn door. "I shall not bend," she murmured, the prayer her husband had taught her when they first claimed this land, before the drought, before the fever, before she learned how quickly allegiances died when fortune turned. A sound reached her then, barely, discernible through the storm's rage, the distant ring of metal against metal, horses' panicked whinnies. Travelers caught in the open. Marion hesitated, one hand on the bar that secured her door against the tempest outside. Wisdom counseled caution. The roads harbored desperate men in these hard times, yet something in those sounds spoke of genuine distress. The storm hammered against her home, demanding entry, as the sounds of struggle grew closer. Marion stood at the threshold of a choice that would echo far beyond the walls of her solitary refuge. The pounding at her door came suddenly, urgent fists against wood, barely audible through the storm's howl. Marion's hand moved instinctively to the iron poker beside the hearth before she approached the entrance, muscles tense with wariness. "Who comes?" she called, voice raised against the tempest. "Travelers seeking shelter, good woman." The reply was nearly lost in a fresh assault of wind. "For mercy's sake!" She drew back the bar with reluctant hands, opening the door just enough to peer into the maelstrom. The storm rushed in immediately, along with 3 figures so caked with sand they seemed born of the tempest itself. Marion stepped back, poker raised, as they stumbled across her threshold. "Secure the door," ordered the tallest among them, his voice carrying the unmistakable command of nobility despite its ragged edge. He supported another man whose head lolled against his shoulder, blood staining the sand encrusted on his temple. The third man pushed the door closed against the wind's fury, dropping the bar into place with hands that trembled from exhaustion. Sand cascaded from their cloaks to her swept floor as they stood swaying before her. "Your companion needs tending," Marion said, lowering the poker slightly, but not setting it aside. The tall one turned, revealing a face half hidden beneath grime, but marked by the sharp features of authority. His eyes, startlingly clear in his dust-covered face, met hers with unexpected dignity. Sir Roland of Ravenscroft, King's commander. He inclined his head slightly. These are my men, Sir Edwin and Sir Gareth. We were separated from our company. When the storm descended, Marian's grip tightened on the poker. Knights of the realm in her humble dwelling. Either blessing or curse, but certainly complication. I have little to offer, Sir Knight, she said plainly, and less reason to trust strangers at my door in such times. Sir Roland glanced at his injured companion, whose breathing came shallow and quick. We ask only shelter until the storm passes. Then we shall trouble you no further. Marian studied them, their exhaustion genuine, their desperation unfeigned. The injured knight would not last the night without aid, and the storm showed no signs of mercy. There is water to wash, she said finally, setting the poker aside, and herbs for the wound. Your horses. Lost, said the third knight, removing his helmet to reveal a young face lined with defeat, along with our provisions. Marian's heart sank. Her meagre stores would stretch even thinner now, yet she gestured toward the small hearth where flames pushed back the storm's chill. Bring him near the fire, she said. As they moved deeper into her sanctuary, Marian watched these armed men invade her solitude, wondering if Christian charity would prove her undoing. The rough-hewn table bore Marian's simple offering, a half-loaf of dark bread, a wedge of hard cheese and thin broth that had simmered with herbs since midday. She set the wooden bowls down with careful precision, aware of how meagre the fare would seem to men accustomed to a lord's table. It is all I have to share, she said, neither apologetic nor proud, simply stating truth. Sir Roland, now cleansed of road dust and sitting unnaturally straight despite his evident exhaustion, regarded the humble meal with a knight's assessment. Outside, the storm battered the shutters with renewed fury, sending fine streams of sand dancing across the packed earthen floor. You honor us with your generosity, Lady Thorne, he said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of court despite their rustic surroundings. Marian's eyes narrowed slightly. I am no lady, Sir Knight, not any more. The younger knight, Sir Gareth, reached eagerly for the bread, but stopped at a glance from his commander. Sir Edwin, his head now bandaged with strips of linen Marian had sacrificed from her stores, sat, with eyes half closed, still dazed from his wound. Sir Roland broke the bread himself, dividing it with careful deliberation. The smallest portion he kept, passing larger shares to his men and offering the largest to Marian. She noted the gesture, a nobleman who served others before himself. The land has been unkind these past seasons, Marian said, accepting her portion with hesitation. The village miller charges more each month, and the stream that feeds my fields grows thinner each summer. Yet you remain, Roland observed, sipping the broth with unexpected appreciation. Where else would I go? The question emerged sharper than intended. My husband's debts stripped away all but this land. Sir Gareth spoke through a mouthful of bread. Your husband was a knight? A lesser lord, Marian corrected, her fingers tracing the worn edge of the table. He rode east with the king's forces 5 harvests past. Fever took him before the fighting could. Something shifted in Roland's expression, recognition or remembrance, quickly masked. I was in the Eastern Campaign, he said simply. The silence that followed held questions unasked, answers unspoken. The younger knights exchanged glances before Sir Edwin cleared his throat. We ride for Ravenscroft Castle, bearing important tidings. For the king, he offered, breaking the tension. Marian studied the commander's face, seeing now the lines of responsibility etched around his eyes. For the first time, she wondered what mission had driven these men through such perilous weather. What urgency had compelled them forward when wisdom would have counselled shelter earlier? "The storm may hold us another day," Sir Roland said, meeting her gaze directly. "We will not abuse your hospitality longer than necessary." Marian nodded, the bread suddenly dry in her mouth as she wondered what consequences might follow from this strange breaking of bread with the king's men. The storm's rage had quieted to a sullen moan, occasional gusts testing the shutters like a child trying a locked door. Embers glowed in the hearth, casting the farmhouse in amber shadows that danced across the sleeping forms of Sir Edwin and Sir Gareth, bundled in borrowed blankets on the floor. Marian sat by the dying fire, fingers working methodically at her mending. She had thought herself alone in wakefulness until Sir Roland's voice came soft from the shadows. "You have known hardship, yet you share what little remains." His words weren't a question but an observation, heavy with something that might have been admiration. She looked up to find him leaning against the wall, watching her with eyes that had seen too much to sleep easily. The firelight caught the silver threads beginning to appear at his temples. "Hardship is common currency these days, Sir Knight," she answered, her needle never pausing, "even for those who serve kings." Roland moved closer, settling on the bench opposite her. Between them the embers shifted, sending a column of sparks upward like fleeing spirits. "Your husband," he said after a long moment, "you said fever took him before battle could. Were you with him at the end?" Marian's hands stilled. "No. Word came by messenger, along with his effects and the notices from creditors." Her voice hardened slightly. "He borrowed against our holdings to outfit himself properly for campaign. He wished to distinguish himself in the king's eyes, and instead left you to bear the weight of his ambitions." Roland's understanding surprised her. The village speaks of it still, how the widow Thorn clings to a worthless patch of land rather than accepting her brother-in-law's charity. Some would call that stubbornness, others courage. "And what would you call it, Sir Roland?" she asked, finally meeting his gaze directly. He studied her face before answering. "Honor!" The word hung between them, fraught with meaning. Outside, the wind sighed, its fury spent. "I led 300 men east," Roland said suddenly, his voice dropping lower. 217 returned. "War claims its tithe," Marian offered. "Not war, my judgment." His hands, calloused from sword and reins, clenched briefly. "I chose the mountain pass despite warnings. We were ambushed. Those men, good men with families awaiting them, died because I would not heed counsel for caution." Marian heard what remained unspoken. The weight he carried, not unlike her own burden of solitary survival. "Yet the king still trusts you with command," she observed. "The king forgives more easily than I do," Roland whispered. Between them the fire surrendered another small sigh of sparks, illuminating the parallel paths that had led them to this moment, this shared darkness where secrets could be spoken. Dawn arrived with tentative fingers of gold, stretching across a transformed landscape. The storm had redrawn the contours of Marian's humble farm, sculpting new dunes against fences and filling the single furrow she had managed to plough with fine, choking sand. The 3 knights stood in her yard, surveying the damage with grim recognition, men accustomed to assessing what remained after destruction had passed. "The eastern road should be passable by midday," Sir Roland said, securing his sword belt with practiced hands. Their armor, cleaned of storm grit, caught the morning light with dull gleams. Marian nodded, pulling her shawl tighter against the dawn chill. Already she felt the silence returning. Seeping back into the spaces these men had briefly filled with their presence. She had wrapped what little bread remained for their journey, an offering that had cost her more than they knew. "We are in your debt, Lady Thorn," Sir Edwin said. His head wound now a clean bandage circling his brow. "I am no lady," she corrected again, the words softer than before. Sir Roland approached, standing close enough that she could see the flecks of amber in his otherwise solemn eyes. "Nobility is not measured by titles alone," he said, voice pitched, for her ears only. "Few would have opened their door as you did." Something tightened in Marian's chest, a feeling she had thought long buried with her husband. "The storm would have claimed you otherwise," she said simply. "Not all storms are made of sand," he replied, his gaze holding hers a moment longer than necessary. He pressed something into her palm, coins, more than she had seen in one place since the creditors came. Her fingers closed around them instinctively. Even as pride stirred, "I require no payment." "Not payment," he interrupted gently. "A knight's debt of honor." The 3 mounted borrowed horses from the village stable, animals too old or weak for regular service but sufficient to carry them, to the nearest royal outpost. As they rode beyond her boundary stones, Sir Roland turned once, raising his hand in a gesture that spoke of more than mere farewell. Marian stood watching until they disappeared beyond the rise, feeling the weight of silence descend once more upon her shoulders. Later, as she cleared the kitchen table of evidence of her guests, a cart rattled past on the road. The miller and his wife, faces turned deliberately away from her gate. They had supplies enough to share, but never once since. Her husband's death had they stopped. She watched them pass, the coins from Sir Roland heavy in her pocket. The connection already felt like a dream, a momentary respite from the life she had grown to accept. Yet something lingered, like the scent of wood smoke that clings to clothing long after the fire dies. The market square of Thornwick village hunched. Beneath an unforgiving sun, a collection of weathered stalls and suspicious eyes, Marian approached with her small basket, clutching the knight's coins deep in her pocket. Necessity alone drove her here. Her flower stores had dwindled past prudence. Conversation ceased as she entered the square. Women drew children closer. Men's gazes slid away like water from oiled cloth. The silence had weight, pressing against her skin with greater force than the sandstorm's fury. At the miller's stall, goodwife Agnes deliberately turned her back. The blacksmith suddenly found his anvil, requiring immediate attention. Only Tobias, the grain merchant, remained, his narrow face pinched with something approaching eagerness. "Good day, Mistress Thorne," he called, voice pitched to carry across the square. "Heard you entertained fine company during the storm." Marian placed her coins on the rough wooden counter. "3 measures of flour," she said quietly, ignoring his baiting. Tobias made no move toward his stores. Strange for king's men to shelter with a widow, wouldn't you say? And without chaperone or family to guard propriety. The coins gleamed between them, more silver than Tobias typically saw in a fortnight. His gaze flicked to them, then back to her face, searching for confirmation of whispered suspicions. "They were travelers caught in the storm," Marian said, her voice steady despite the heat rising in her cheeks. Christian charity required nothing less. "Charity!" The word came sharp from goodwife Agnes, who had abandoned all pretense of disinterest. "Is that what they call it now?" Father Thomas, emerging from the small stone church, paused at the edge of the gathering crowd. His silence carried more judgment than the gossip's words. 3 measures of flour," Marian repeated, pushing the coins forward. Tobias sniffed. "Perhaps the price has changed for some." "The price," came the deep voice of Walter the blacksmith, "is the same for all who trade honestly." His unexpected intervention hung in the air, neither support nor condemnation. Marian stood immobile, dignity her only shield against their stares. She had known isolation since her husband's death, but this new venom stung deeper. Tobias grudgingly measured the flour, his movements deliberate and slow. "Strange times when a woman who can't pay her tithe suddenly has silver to spend," he muttered. "Stranger still when royal knights visit farms instead of manor houses." As Marian gathered her purchase, the priest finally spoke. "The Lord sees all that happens in darkness, daughter," Remember that before you open your door to strange men again." She walked from the square with her back straight, feeling the weight of their judgment heavier than her basket. The connection she had briefly treasured with Sir Roland now twisted in the town's suspicious minds into something shameful, something forbidden. The spade bit into reluctant earth, each thrust requiring more strength than Marion could readily spare. 2 days had passed since her humiliation in the village square, yet her muscles still coiled tight with indignation. The sun beat mercilessly upon her back as she worked to clear the sandstorm's remnants from what pitiful furrows she had managed to carve. "Yield your bounty," she muttered to the land, an old prayer her husband had taught her in better times. The soil answered with stones and resistance. Her hands, once soft with youth and station, now bore calluses thick as leather. Each blister was a reminder of how far she had fallen, and how stubbornly she refused to surrender what little remained. The small pouch of coins from Sir Roland lay hidden beneath the hearthstone, untouched since her return from town. Pride would not allow her to spend more, though her stomach growled its protest. A tremor passed through her shoulders as she straightened, surveying the meagre progress of the morning's labor. The field that had once supported a modest household now struggled to feed one woman and her thin goat. The storm had only worsened her prospects, burying seedlings beneath layers of grit. "I shall not bend," she whispered, echoing the mantra that had sustained her through 5 solitary seasons. Yet even as the words left her lips, doubt shadowed them. How much longer could she maintain this battle against earth and sky and human? Cruelty? Memories of Sir Roland's steady gaze surfaced unbidden. The way he had broken bread, serving others before himself. The quiet understanding in his eyes when she spoke of her struggles. Such nobility seemed a dream now, something glimpsed fleetingly before darkness closed in once more. The goat bleated a warning from its tether near the fence. Marion looked up, squinting against the harsh light. Beyond the far ridge, a plume of dust rose, not the billowing wall of a sandstorm, but the purposeful cloud that followed mounted men. She leaned upon her spade, heart quickening. Travelers were rare on this road, especially since the storm had passed. Fear and something dangerously close to hope warred within her breast. Then came the sound, distant yet distinct, metal clanking against metal, the distinctive cadence of many hooves moving in formation rather than the scattered rhythm of merchants' mules. As the sun slipped toward afternoon, the sounds grew clearer. Not just horses and armor, but voices carried on the wind. Men's voices calling commands with military precision. Marion stood motionless in her field, spade clutched in dirt-encrusted fingers, waiting as the distant thunder drew ever closer to her door. Sunset painted the western sky in wounded hues of amber and crimson as Marion stood rigid upon her porch. Steps. The sound that had been distant thunder at midday had grown to unmistakable purpose, horses and men approaching with deliberate intent. Dust rose from the road in a continuous cloud, backlit by the dying sun into a curtain of gold. She had changed her dress, the only other she possessed, and smoothed her hair beneath a clean kerchief. Foolishness, perhaps, but dignity remained her final weapon. One hand clutched the worn porch rail, the other held the small knife used for kitchen tasks, hidden in the folds of her skirt. The first riders crested the rise, silhouetted against the burning sky, not 3 men as before, but a column stretching back beyond counting. Sunlight glinted from polished armor and helms, from spear tips and sword hilts. Banners fluttered above, not the simple pennants of minor lords, but the royal standard itself, its colors vivid even in the fading light. Marion's breath caught. "God preserve me," she whispered, the knife suddenly useless against such magnificence and threat. The lead rider separated from the column, urging his mount forward at a canter. Even before he drew close enough for features to be distinguished, she recognized the set of his shoulders, the way he held himself in the saddle. Sir Roland. He reined in before her gate, removing his helm with a gesture somehow both formal and intimate. Behind him, the column of knights continued to materialize from the dust. 30, 40, perhaps more. Some led pack horses laden with bundles. Others drove carts heaped with supplies. "Lady Thorne," Roland called, his voice carrying the same measured cadence she remembered from whispered confidences by dying embers. Fear and hope tangled in Marian's chest, rendering her momentarily mute. What game of kings was this? What purpose could bring royal knights to her forgotten threshold? "I bring greetings from His Majesty," Roland continued, dismounting with fluid grace, "and the fulfillment of a debt of honor." The knife slipped forgotten from her fingers as Roland approached, his steps stirring small clouds from soil still loose from the storm. His eyes held hers steady, without artifice or guile. What debt could possibly require such? She gestured helplessly at the overwhelming force assembling beyond her fence. Roland stopped at the foot of her steps, close enough that she could see the weariness beneath his formal demeanor, the hope beneath his restraint. "You fed the king's champion when he had nothing," he said softly. "Now he returns that kindness tenfold." The farmyard transformed before Marian's disbelieving eyes. Knights dismounted in disciplined formation, servants unloaded carts brimming. With provisions and stable hands led forward livestock, 2 sturdy oxen, several sheep and chickens in wicker cages. Men moved with purpose, unloading sacks of grain, barrels of salt fish, bundles of tools, and crates filled with necessities she had long done without. "This cannot be meant for me," she whispered, still rooted to her porch steps. "There must be some error." Sir Roland stood beside her, watching as his men executed their tasks with military efficiency. "No error, Lady Thorne. Had you turned us away during the storm, all would have been lost." A knight approached, bowing with deference. "The seeds are being stored as directed, Sir Champion. Shall we begin repairs to the barn roof?" Champion. The title rang in Marian's ears like a bell. She turned to Roland, comprehension dawning. "You are the king's champion, the one they said was lost in the eastern campaigns?" Roland's mouth curved slightly. "Not lost. Merely separated from my men when our mission required discretion. The storm was unexpected, but perhaps providential. It brought us to your door, pride warred with necessity in Marian's breast. I cannot accept such charity. I have managed alone these 5 seasons." "This is not charity," Roland interrupted gently. "It is justice. The realm owes its champion his life, and I owe that life to you." A servant girl approached, arms laden with fabric, linens and wool of quality Marian had not touched since before her husband's death. The girl curtsied deeply, eyes downcast, before the widow who had sheltered. "The king's champion, your kindness preserved more than 3 hungry men," Roland continued. "The message we carry affects the kingdom's very security. Had we perished, much more than our lives would have been forfeit." Marian watched as men replanted her field with ordered precision, as carpenters assessed her sagging roof, as a royal cook prepared a meal over a fire near the barn. The scale of assistance threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained independence. "I cannot repay this," she said, voice barely audible. Roland's hand moved as if to touch hers, then withdrew. "There is nothing to repay. You gave when you had nothing to spare, asked no questions when wisdom counseled suspicion, and showed nobility that surpasses any title." Tears threatened, but Marian blinked them away. 5 years of solitary struggle had taught her that tears changed nothing. Yet now, watching her farm bloom with renewed possibility, something long dormant stirred within her chest. "The king would meet the woman who saved his champion," Roland said quietly, "when you are ready." By midday, word had spread to Thornwick village. The royal standard visible from the road spoke volumes, and curious eyes had witnessed the transformation unfolding at the widow's farm. Knights cleared fields that had languished for seasons. Carpenters strengthened beams that had sagged since before Lord Thorne's passing. A new well was being dug where the old one had begun to fail. Marian stood in the shadow of her repaired porch, watching a procession approach from the village, Father Thomas leading, flanked by Tobias the merchant and Master Walter. Behind them followed Goodwife Agnes and the miller, faces arranged in expressions of pious concern. Sir Roland appeared at Marian's side, his presence solid and reassuring. "Visitors," he observed, voice neutral though his eyes had hardened. "They bring years of silence with them," Marian replied softly. The delegation halted at the newly mended gate. Father Thomas cleared his throat, his gaze darting between the royal knights and Marian's simple figure. "Lady Thorne," he began, the title he had never used before falling awkwardly from his lips. "We come to ensure your well-being after the recent disturbances." "Disturbances?" Roland echoed, one eyebrow raised. Tobias stepped forward, bowing deeply. The storm, of course, and now this unexpected blessing from the king's own men. Thornwick has always held Mistress Thorne in highest regard. A knight working nearby made a sound suspiciously like a suppressed laugh. "Strange," Marian said, finding courage in Roland's presence beside her. "I recall different words in the market square mere days ago." Goodwife Agnes flushed crimson. Walter studied his boots with sudden interest. "A misunderstanding," Father Thomas soothed. "The parish has prayed diligently for your circumstances to improve, yet brought no bread when her stores ran empty," Roland observed. "Offered no labor when her fields needed tending." "We had no knowledge," Tobias began. "You had eyes," Marian interrupted, surprising herself with her steady voice. "You saw my need and turned away. Not once in 5 years did any of you extend Christian charity, yet you speak of prayers." Silence fell, broken only by the sound of hammers and the lowing of new cattle in the field beyond. Father Thomas recovered first. "The church stands ready to assist in ministering to these good men the king has sent. Perhaps a special mass of thanksgiving. The king's champion needs no intermediary for God's favor," Roland said quietly. "Nor does Lady Thorne require sudden friendship born of calculating hearts." Marian stepped forward, taking her place beside Roland rather than in his shadow. "You may tell the village that my door remains open to any who come in genuine need, as it always has been." 7 days had passed since the knight's arrival, and Marian barely recognized her own land. Fields once choked with weeds now stood neatly furrowed and planted with winter wheat. The sagging barn had been straightened, its roof newly thatched. A stone wall rose where a simple fence had struggled against the wind. Even the air felt different, filled with purpose rather than desperation. Marian walked the edge of the eastern field, fingers trailing over green shoots already pushing through dark soil. Sir Roland fell into step beside her, his armor exchanged for simpler garments when overseeing the work. "The men will finish the new storage building by week's end," he said. "The harvest will have proper protection from the elements." "A harvest I may not see," Marian replied softly. "You speak of months hence, when your duty will have called you elsewhere." Roland stopped, turning to face her. The setting sun caught, the silver at his temples, the lines etched by responsibility around his eyes. "My duty has many facets," he said carefully, "some more enduring than others." A worker called from the new well, breaking the moment. Roland answered, his attention divided by command. Marian continued walking, uncertain of her footing in this transformed landscape, both physical and emotional. 5 years of solitude had taught her wariness. Hope was a luxury she had abandoned along with her title and station. Yet here it grew again, unbidden, as the seedlings pushing through soil that had once seemed barren beyond recovery. Later, as twilight settled across the farm, Marian found Roland standing alone by the new stone wall. His hand rested on the carefully fitted rocks, face contemplative in the fading light. "You've been quiet today," she observed, stopping beside him. "Considering paths," he answered. "The king expects my return, yet—" "Yet?" Roland turned to her, the formal commander momentarily set aside. "There are debts of honor, and then there are callings of the heart. Sometimes they align." Marian's breath caught. 5 years of solitary determination had built walls higher than the stone before them. Walls that had protected her when no one else would. Walls now threatening to crumble. Beneath this man's steady gaze, "I have forgotten how to trust," she admitted, the words barely audible above the evening breeze. "How to believe in anything beyond survival." Roland's hand moved, hesitant, to cover hers atop the wall they had built together. "Then perhaps we begin there, with survival, then move toward living." Around them the farm settled into evening rhythms, knights and workers returning to their camps, animals being tended for the night. The land that had once symbolized Marian's isolation now hummed with renewed possibility. "What comes next?" she asked, not pulling her hand away. The evening painted the farmhouse in gentle amber light, so different from the choking dust that had first brought Roland to Marian's door. 3 weeks had passed since the knight's arrival. Most had returned to the king's service, leaving behind a transformed landscape where barren furrows once stretched. Only Roland remained. His duty temporarily yielded to something neither had dared name. Marian stood on the porch, watching swallows dart above fields now green with promise. The new wool of her dress caught the breeze, a simple garment, yet finer than anything she had worn since her husband's death. Change had come in small mercies and large gestures, in repaired beams and replanted fields. Roland joined her, carrying 2 wooden cups of cider pressed from the small orchard they had discovered beneath years of neglect. Their fingers brushed as she accepted the offering, a touch that would have seemed impossible mere weeks ago. "A messenger arrived this morning," he said, his voice carrying the same measured cadence she had come to treasure during quiet evenings. "The king requests my counsel at court." Marian nodded, unsurprised. The world beyond her boundaries had continued its inexorable turning. Wars needed champions, kings needed advisors. The borrowed peace of these weeks had been just that, borrowed. "When do you ride?" she asked, her voice steady despite the familiar weight settling in her chest. Roland studied the horizon where the road disappeared into gathering dusk. "That depends," he said softly, "on what awaits my return." The question hung between them, weightier than any formal declaration. Marian turned to face him fully, seeing not the king's champion, but the man who had broken bread at her table, who had rebuilt her walls both physical and unseen. "What of your duty?" she asked. "My duty remains," he answered, "but perhaps it can be fulfilled differently than before." His hand, calloused from both sword and recent labor, moved to cover hers on the porch rail. "The king has granted me stewardship of the eastern marches. These lands would fall under my protection." "And the steward requires a home," Marian observed, her voice barely above a whisper. "More than a home," Roland replied, his eyes holding hers. "A purpose beyond battle. A companion who understands both sacrifice and survival." No grand declarations passed between them, no poetry or passionate pledges. They had both lived too long with grief's company to trust in easy promises. Instead, Marian simply turned her hand beneath his, their fingers interlacing with quiet certainty. Together, they watched the horizon darken, no longer searching for approaching storms or the dust of distant riders. Whatever approached now, they would face as one,